thank you for being here to discuss the future of journalism, especially the future of journalism in Chicago. And we like to think there's no better place to have this conversation than here at Northwestern and Medill. Joseph Medill, for those of you who don't know, our namesake, was a former Chicago mayor, co-owner of the Chicago Tribune, and a leading abolitionist. I tell people I'm very grateful that he was on the right side of history there, because it'd be difficult for me to preside over a school if he were not an abolitionist. We can draw on the lessons from Joseph Medill that helped guide us through today's challenges and opportunities. Regardless of what your political leanings may be, I think we all would agree that we're at a pivotal moment in the history of our fragile democracy. One of the pillars of this democracy, a thriving local news ecosystem, is in itself in a very precarious position. Now, I might venture to guess that those of you gathered here are particularly knowledgeable about the fate and state of local news. The reality is that a vast swath of our fellow citizens do not and are not really familiar with what is happening in local news and the rending of the fabric of our communities. Local news, I like to say, is the tie that binds us. It's the lens through which we see ourselves, our trials, our tragedies, and our triumphs. So it's incumbent upon us to respond to this moment of reckoning and reinvention of local news. How we respond to this challenge will shape our future. And if by chance, and I doubt this is true, you are unsure about the necessity to address the local news crisis, I hope the conversation this evening will help you see that strengthening local journalism has a ripple effect. It does indeed fortify our community and helps protect our democracy. At Medill, we've made a strategic shift in our own constitution to address this issue. For decades, Medill was known primarily as one of the premier training grounds for future writers, reporters, editors, and marketers. We were and continue to be a hands-on, skills-based school that prepares the next generation of journalists to, as we like to proudly say, hit the ground running. But as the news industry was knocked off its mooring by the digital tsunami, we realized that Medill needed to be much more. We had to draw upon the resources at Northwestern, as well as our own deep connections in journalism, to help address the rapid implosion and subsequent diminution of local news. Our local news initiative, under the brilliant leadership of Senior Associate Dean Tim Franklin, is at the center of these efforts. With the help from many in Chicago's philanthropic community, we've placed ourselves in the eye of the local news storm and are helping to chart a path forward for an industry that's reeling. Let me highlight just a few components. We're leading research into the information needs of Chicagoland residents. We've launched Teach for Chicago Journalism under another brilliant colleague who's here today, Mike Spikes, which focuses on media literacy and attempts to ignite a passion for journalism in young people who may not realize the power and possibilities that a career in this business presents. Our Illinois News Bureau is filling in critical gaps in local coverage. Our Solutions Journalism Hub, which trains journalists to tell stories that reframe the traditional problem-centric narrative into stories that focus on the ways in which experts, scholars, and citizens attempt to address those issues. In that way, we're trying to produce journalism that helps readers take an active role in improving their communities. And our Local News Accelerator, which convenes cohorts of local news outlets for a nearly year-long exploration of their operation that's fostering innovation and financial stability for those entities. So far, we've worked with close to 20 local news outlets. Medill is an institution with a proud century-long history of producing fine journalists, including dozens of Pulitzer Prize, Peabody, and Emmy winners. Now, with the collaboration and support of Chicago's philanthropic community, including entities like the Chicago Community Trust and initiatives like Press Forward Chicago, we're working to build a robust backbone for Chicago's media ecosystem. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Andrea Sands, the president and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, to share a few words about Press Forward Chicago and the topics we'll be exploring this evening. Andrea.
Thank you so much, Charles. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, and thanks so much to the entire Medill team who is hosting us today. We all deserve, and our democracy requires, a robust local news environment that informs, engages, and reflects the beautiful and complex diversity of all of Chicagoans and all of our communities. Chicago is and has always been a great news town, from the groundbreaking journalism of the muckraking investigative reporting of the 20th century to the critical work being done by the folks who are in the room, from whom we'll hear in just a moment. But we are not, sadly, immune to the challenges facing news and journalism nationally and probably globally. According to the Medill Local News Initiative, and I hear a new report is coming out tomorrow, so this is from the previous report, forgive me, residents in more than half of US counties have no or very limited access to reliable local news sources. In Illinois, 4 counties have no local news sources, and 34 rely on a single source for their news. While Chicago has a vibrant and visible, hyper-local and nonprofit media organization ecosystem serving many of our diverse communities, we're not immune, as I said. Journalism jobs at Illinois newspapers overall have declined 85% since 2005. Now just, think about that for a moment. Press Forward Chicago is our collective response to these challenges. We work with individual donors, institutional funders, news organizations, and in coalition with a group of national partners led by the MacArthur and Knight Foundation Press Forward national effort to strengthen local journalism and really to support the development of a sustainable news ecosystem in the face of all of the changes, the dynamism that is happening in the marketplace. This past May, Press Forward Chicago made its inaugural round of grants to 13 news organizations with a priority on investing in those small organizations with under $2 million annual operating budgets. Among them are the outlets represented by our panelists today, the Invisible Institute, the Lansing Journal, and Investigative Project on Race and Equity. We have big aspirations for Press Forward Chicago to continue the Chicago Community Trust tradition of supporting local journalism. In 1990, the Trust invested in the creation of Chicago Matters. Some of you may remember it. It was a long-running journalism and public affairs series that partnered WTTW, WBEZ, the Chicago Public Library, and the Chicago Reporter to produce documentaries and town meetings around topics such as the environment, immigration, education, and housing. Because we are competitive in Chicago and have a lot of hometown pride, I'm pleased to be able to brag and to always be able to brag forever and ever that Press Forward Chicago was the first of the many Press Forward locals across the country to get grants into the hands of journalism organizations. We have yet to see any other local get grants into the hands of local journalism organizations, and the Press Forward National effort just made their first grants last week. So we were ahead of them as well. And, really, this is a testament to Chicago's spirit of collaboration and generosity. Our civic community is like no other, and we do know how to roll up our sleeves and get things done together. Chicago is leading the way today, and we're just getting started. We really want to make sure that we remain a hub for excellent, innovative reporting that holds our leaders and institutions to account, that represents the distinct experiences of Chicagoans across all of our neighborhoods and communities, and that, at the end of the day, ensures that people have the information they need to take action on the issues that most affect them, their families, their futures, their communities. I'm going to introduce the panel in a minute, but I wanted to first share some important Press Forward Chicago news. We have just convinced a wonderful leader to join as executive director for Press Forward Chicago, and she happens to be here today. Tracy Boehm will start this coming January in the role, but she's agreed to come hang out with us in the meantime while she wraps up other projects, and I couldn't be more thrilled. So I encourage you, if you have time, to get to know Tracy. Her record of journalistic excellence and leadership is like no other. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Tracy. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce another journalism icon for the city of Chicago, our moderator for this afternoon's discussion, Natalie Y. Moore. Her voice is familiar to many of you. For over 15 years at WBEZ, Natalie's reporting addressed race, housing, economic development, food justice, and many other important issues for our communities. She's the author of The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, winner of the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for Nonfiction. Natalie also writes a monthly column for the Chicago Sun-Times. She's also a Medill alum and recently joined the faculty as a senior lecturer and the director of audio journalism programming here. She just came down from her office upstairs to join us this evening. Please welcome to the podium, Natalie Moore.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. So on Mondays and Wednesdays in this space, there's a class called Journalism Values, Trends, and Practices that is taught. And I teach one of the sections. My colleague, Matt Kiefer, teaches one. I don't know if I'm missing anyone else who's here. And the good news is that despite the mistrust in media, people think more highly of their local press and news than they do nationally. And that's because journalists are connected here, they're not swooping in, they're part of the community. So there is some silver lining despite all the dumpster fire that we're being told about journalism. And like Andrea said, that we have a long history here in this city of having great journalism, from the muckraking of Upton Sinclair in the Stockyards to the Chicago Defender to Tracy Boehm in Windy City Times. And in the past 20 years, even less, we have seen a marketplace grow with the news. For so long, it was just the hegemony of two papers, and it's great that we still have two papers in this town. So Chicago is a great news town. There's great journalists, and we're gonna talk about some of those challenges, but there is that silver lining, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. So first up, I wanna introduce Laura Washington, who has a column at the Chicago Tribune and is a political analyst at ABC7. And she used to be a columnist at the Sun-Times, and she was a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics. She has more than 2 decades of journalism experience. She gave me my first internship back in 1995 at the Chicago Reporter, and now she has embarked on the investigative project on race. We have Melanie Youngsma, who is from Lansing, Illinois, and has done a lot of reporting on Tiffany Hayard, who we hear about in the news a lot these days. I can't wait to dig in more about that. She founded the Lansing Journal in 2017 with a mission of building community. The venture began as a partnership with The Shopper in South Holland, which is a free weekly print paper. And the pandemic forced The Shopper's press operations to stop, and the owner decided to get out of the newspaper publishing business altogether. And so Melanie had this idea and she took over. And then we have, rounding out the panel, Andrew Fan, who is executive director of the Invisible Institute, where he coordinates work across the organization's teams. He previously was a chief operating officer and a data reporter and part of a team that produced the series Maud, When Police Dogs Are Weapons, a year-long investigation into police canine units, which won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting. He also led the team at City Bureau, which partnered with WBEZ to publish Where Banks Don't Lend, a 2020 investigation that revealed the racial disparities in Chicago home lending. So let's give our panelists a round of applause, and please join me. So this week, Andrew will be traveling to New York with colleagues to celebrate not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes won this year. Yes, let's give a big applause for that. One in partnership with City Bureau for a series on Chicago police have mishandled missing person cases, and the second for an audio series revisiting a hate crime that occurred on Chicago's South Side in 1997. So Andrew, can you tell us how these 2 stories came about? What was the germination of these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, we're such a small newsroom, and I think when we won a Pulitzer Prize in 2021, we kind of had a collective conversation like, this is incredible and this will never happen again, and that's okay. And I do think that was important because I don't think we've set out to produce projects that are gonna go after these kinds of things where a local Chicago outlet, it's not an outcome that makes sense to think about. And I think with each of these projects, they actually emerged out of ways of thinking and reporting that I think had been in motion basically since the Invisible Institute started in 2015, and some of them even going further back. But in the case of Trina's reporting, Trina Reynolds-Tyler, our director of data, her reporting on missing persons came out of years of thinking about what police don't actually report about, what doesn't show up in their information, what doesn't show up in the reports that they file, which led her, as a data scientist, to actually do a ton of work with community members to actually apply a bunch of machine learning to police complaint files. She was like, what are they actually talking about that they don't put in the data sets? And that's actually what led her to missing persons. And eventually led her to talk to dozens and dozens of people in the city about what had happened to them, what had it been like to experience a loved one go missing, what response did they get from the city? And then to go back with that kind of information, with those counts, and validate them against what does the department say that they're doing? What does their own data say? What do their own records say? And so for us, it was an idea that I think we've been wrestling with for a really long time, that we had enough space to really look at with, I think, the time it really deserved. So I think that's what allowed us to do that. And I think in a similar way with our audio project with You Didn't See Nothing. That started as a series of conversations between our founder, Jamie Calvin, and Johan Sinclair, who was ultimately the host and whose story was really told by the podcast. I remember when they first started talking in the office in 2017. They were like, what is this? They were just kind of sounding each other out, figuring out how to maybe tell Johan's story. Johan's is an incredible narrative storyteller. And I think you, just having met him, you're like, oh, he's really compelling. And he knows how to tell his own story. But I think what was really striking was the long partnership with him and the other audio journalists on the team, allowed them to make something that when I heard it, actually come out in public, I was like, oh, this sounds like Johan's. It sounds like you're talking to him. And it sounds like he's telling the story the way that he wanted to tell it, which I think, again, helped it stand out in a way that I think it wouldn't have if we tried to kind of fit it into a more traditional format. So I think having that space in both cases really allowed us to kind of tell stories that were ultimately able to have different kinds of impact.
The ecology of the news market means that you have to have people producing stories to fill the news holes with 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, WBBM radio, the newspapers, you have to have something every day, multiple stories. But any journalist in this city is going to tell you that they wish they could just spend a year or longer doing what they want to do for a project. So what does it take to produce the kind of in-depth reporting that you all do, because you're not in the daily grind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of what we've been trying to figure out over the last decade, has been, how do you keep doing that? Because I think we went through a period where we launched, we had a lot of excitement. Jamie published a lot of powerful reporting. He published Code of Silence. And then we watched like interest kind of shift, funding kind of shift, and we found it much, much harder to keep that kind of work going. And so I think Anmuli, our development directors here, Anmuli and myself and the whole team have been thinking together about like what kind of structures do you put in place, both in terms of, I've mentioned our 2 longest projects, but we publish a lot more things on the regular in terms of shorter investigations, in terms of our data sites like CPDP, where you can go and look up police complaints. We put up things that are much more regularly used by Chicagoans as part of the balance and the mix of being an outlet these days. And then I think we also talk a lot with those people who do support us about why it actually is worth it to spend time on these longer investigations. I think there's a reason every journalist wants that much time, is because you can actually get to a different kind of story if you have the space. So for us, I think it's both finding a balance where we're aware we can't publish once a year. That would be kind of wild. But I think also finding a world where we do explain to the people who are our core supporters, we need a little bit more room than you're used to giving. We need a little bit more space to give this some time. And when we produce something with that space, it's gonna be worth it, and you're gonna understand why we wanted that space. So I'd like to pretend we found a perfect formula, and I don't think we have, but I think that's the balance and the struggle that we're really wrestling with.
Laura, what would you say is the biggest pivot or disruptor you've seen in local news in your time being a journalist here?
Well, first, thank you, Natalie. I would just like to thank the Trust and Medill for hosting this event, and thank Press Forward for the important civic contribution they're making to keep journalism alive and keep it strong. I think the big pivot is money. I think that the media landscape, as you heard from Andrea's remarks in terms of what the data shows about layoffs, about losses in the news business, is because the economic model has changed, and we all know why and how it's changed, but it's meant, in some ways, news organizations have to be a lot more hungry, or they are more hungry and greedy, to work not only harder and faster, but to work with each other. I came out of the Chicago Reporter, which was mentioned earlier, and the Chicago Reporter, just to back up, because there's an important legacy point here, there was a comment that we're living in a very rich ecosystem, particularly for nonprofit journalism now. We've got dozens of nonprofit news organizations in Chicago. Well, the one reason for that is because Chicago has a huge, long, storied history of nonprofit journalism that dates back to the 70s and 80s. The Chicago Reporter, where I started my career, was one of those, just a handful of nonprofit news organizations at a time when the big media, the legacy media, was the big powerhouse in the city. There was also some of you who were maybe some of the more senior members in the room might remember the Neighborhood Works, which was a news organization, a newsletter that covered community issues, Chicago Enterprise, which did best business and economic issues. There were maybe a handful like that back in the 70s and 80s, but that's where it all started. And I think that tradition continues today in many new ways. But back in those days, we kind of worked in isolation. We worked in silos, and it wasn't by intent, but because we were the little guys on the block. We were these little nonprofit organizations that they're nice and they're do-gooders, but they don't really have that much impact. We did have a lot of impact, but in the scheme of the way the civic leadership looked at media, the way the media powerhouses looked at media, we were not that essential. But we were doing really important work. Well, now, all the big shots realize that you need to work together. You need to get outside of those silos. You need to collaborate. When I was running the Chicago Reporter, we had to beg. We were really more of a news service. We were a newsletter for a while, then we were a magazine, but we were doing a lot of data-heavy investigative reporting, like the kind of reporting we're doing now for the investigative project on race and equity. And our job was to get that information, that data, into the hands of the big media because they had the spotlight, and then maybe the civic leaders, the policymakers, the politicians would pay attention to them and listen. But we had to go hand in hand to these news organizations because they were the big shots. And like, okay, well, maybe we'll look at your story. Maybe we'll publish your story. And they did publish some of our stories, but it was never a real partnership. It was basically we were providing them with information and data, and I think interestingly enough, information and data that they should have been reporting and collecting and sharing, but they weren't because race and equity, in the case of Chicago Reporter, wasn't on their radar at the time. now everyone wants to collaborate, and all of us in one way or another are collaborating with other news organizations, with other civic organizations, because, to answer your question, Natalie, because the resources are much thinner, because every news organization, particularly the legacy news organizations, are struggling now. They've lost their financial model. They're trying to regain their footing and find a new way to make money, and they need partners, they need support, and they need help. And I think that that's where the Press Forward and all the news organizations that they're supporting come in, because we can find ways to collaborate, not just with the big boys and girls, but with each other.
Melanie, so I mentioned the Mayor Tiffany, so she's in Dalton, Tiffany Henyard, and if you're not following, it's wild. Like it seems like it's out of central casting almost if you're painting a character. And she's memes, like people all over the country are watching this. So when a story like this becomes a national story and regional story, what role does a community outlet like yours play?
Yeah, in fact, she's international. She's
And corrected.
yeah, and Tiffany Henyard represents really a fascinating case study of the interconnection of different forms of media. I am the only local newspaper there most of the time, and YouTubers are there. That's a new form of, sometimes it's journalism, sometimes it's something else. The Chicago broadcasters are there reporting on this. And I should point out that we started reporting on Tiffany Henyard back in March of 2022 because it was a local story. She is the elected mayor of Dalton, which is a village near Lansing. I live in Lansing. And she was appointed as supervisor of Thornton Township. And township is a level of government between the municipal level and the county level. So there are 17 villages within Thornton Township. Lansing is one of them and Dalton is one of them. So there was already some controversy there when she was appointed supervisor. We were there at that meeting because our community asked us to be, because it was local news and we were there to keep our community informed about what was happening in the community. YouTubers came later, and then broadcast media started coming because she was so sensational and she really makes good TV. And we, you know, we all bring something to the table. It's important for me to be there, but it's also important for them to be there. They have reach and resources that I don't have. They are bringing attention to the problem that I couldn't do by myself. So that's important. When we're all at a meeting together in our little media section, YouTubers get it out fast. They're live streaming the meeting and people are watching that. Broadcasters have teams of people who are getting ready for the 9 o'clock news and the 10 o'clock news. So they're telling a quick version of the story right away that night. I can't do that, but I go home with my video footage and I spend time reviewing it. I add the little descriptors on the screen showing who's speaking, what the motions are, what's being discussed. And I publish that a day or two later on our YouTube channel. And I have YouTube commenters telling me they've been waiting for this video because they saw the live stream and it didn't make sense. And they need those little captions to understand what's going on. And they know that I'm local. They know that I'm there, that I've been there since the beginning. So they trust me to make sense of what's happening with this crazy story. It is literally unbelievable. Nobody can believe it. And so they trust us to make sense of it. And that's the role that the newspaper is playing. That's the role we're playing right now. I also want to remind people that someday Tiffany won't be supervisor of Thornton Township, and whoever is the next supervisor might be just as corrupt, but might be boring, might be subtle. So the YouTubers and broadcasters are not going to show up for that. The Lansing Journal will still be there. because we're reporting our community news because it's community news, not because it's sensational.
When did you decide that you would incorporate YouTubing in your coverage, or were you already doing that as part of your coverage?
YouTube has been a ride for us. We used to just use YouTube as a place to host our videos. We would shoot a video and publish it on YouTube, and then I would embed it in an article the next day and publish the article and expect people to read the article and watch the YouTube in the article. We started getting comments on our YouTube channel from people who never visited our website. And I realized gradually, it took me a while, that there's this whole YouTube community out there who never comes to our website. They don't live in Lansing, they don't live in Thornton Township. They're here for the Tiffany Henyard drama, but what warms my heart about this is some of them are telling me, we see what's happening, and I'm inspired to start attending my own village board meetings. I want to get involved in my community. People in Kentucky and Australia and Germany are getting more involved in their communities because of this travesty that's happening in Dalton and Thornton Township.
Oh, that's a real testament to civic engagement. And just one last follow-up to that. Can you tell us some of the stories that you all have broken or angles that you have covered that other outlets haven't because they weren't there all the time?
One thing that a lot of people get wrong about Tiffany Henyard is, and I hear this in YouTube comments as well, people sort of blame the community for electing her. There's kind of a lot of the comments are, well, you get what you deserve, you get what you vote for, and now you're paying the price. They don't realize that the people did not elect Tiffany Henyard into that supervisor position. There's a whole political drama that goes on that got her appointed. So it's not the people's fault. And they don't realize how engaged the people, the community, has been in trying to get her out of office. They have contacted all the levels of government higher up than Tiffany Henyard, asking for help. They've submitted FOIA requests. They've contacted the Attorney General's office. They've contacted the Public Access Bureau about violations of the Open Meetings Act. This community is involved, and they do deserve better. And so it's important for me to make that point whenever I get the chance.
Laura, can you share the arc of the Chicago Reporter to the investigative project?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the Chicago Reporter was launched in the 70s, in 1972, in fact, and it's, I think, close to 54 years old now. And it was started by John McDermott, who was a civil rights activist in the 60s, worked with Martin Luther King and a lot of other local civil rights leaders. And he wanted to create an institution, a news organization that would report on race and class in dispassionately, just the facts, just the data. And so that was sort of the foundation of who we were and what we were. It's from the beginning. As I said, it started as this real thin tissue paper newsletter. The funny thing is, John's concept of it was that he wanted a thin newspaper, sort of an 8.5 by 11 newsletter that you could fold up and put into your pocket. And of course, you know, that meant a guy's pocket, a suit pocket, because back in those days, men ran the world, right? So, but it evolved. It eventually became more of a magazine format. We got online on the web, and then it had its ups and downs in terms of its vitality over the years. But it broke an incredible number of stories, had a large impact, made a lot of change in terms of righting wrongs and injustice in the city through its investigative reporting. And we also were seen as a training institute, so we brought many young people through there, including Natalie Moore, who went on to become very famous and successful. Matt Kiefer is another one who's in the room, who's also on the faculty at Medill, and we have Pulitzer Prize winners. We have people that have worked at the Washington Post, New York Times, on and on and on. But in, like, during the pandemic, it kind of started to lose its way, and the Community Renewal Society, which was the nonprofit organization which was housing and supporting it for almost 50 years, decided to take it in another direction. And when the reporter alumni heard about that, and we've got hundreds of alumni all over the country that are still in the business and still care very much about not only the reporter, but about these issues. When we heard about the fact that it was fading away, we said no and put our feet down and said, we're not going to have this. We're going to start a new news organization that's going to carry on the legacy. And that is the Investigative Project on Race and Equity, which we launched about, we were in the planning stages for a year or so, but we launched it about 2 years ago. It's a little baby startup, but it's carrying on the mission in a little bit of a different way. There's no newsletter, there's no magazine, there's no paper. It's online, and we don't do investigations on our own any longer. We, as I said, we collaborate with other news organizations. We did a great, our first collaboration was with Matt and WBEZ when Matt was still there. We have some other ones in the works. But the idea is to bring forward investigative reporting on race and equity, data-driven reporting on race and equity to measure where the problems are in the city and to address them in ways that make it very powerful and compelling and force the city leadership to respond and make change. The other side of our mission is training. So we have a training institute. We have an apprenticeship program which brings young journalists on. We also have a training institute where we provide regular training sessions in that data-driven investigative reporting that is such a rare thing to have access to. Not every reporter in the city and even in the major newspapers gets that kind of opportunity. We offer that opportunity there, and we particularly focus, not exclusively on journalists of color, but we're focusing primarily on recruiting and finding and training journalists of color, because that is an area where most journalists of color don't get the opportunity to do investigative reporting because it's always been considered sort of this highfalutin, high-flying profession and opportunity. So we've singled out that as part of our mission, and so we're carrying on the reporter legacy in new ways.
Andrew, what does partnership look like at the Invisible Institute?
That's a great question. I mean, I think in a similar way to what Laura was just saying, like almost everything we've ever done has been some kind of partnership. And I think that's like increasingly true in the media ecosystem. I think, as you pointed out, there's a lot of structural reasons for that in addition to just, what our newsroom wants to do. But I think we've always found it like a really important way to do work. I think especially because our projects often look fairly different. We're not always, we don't know everything. We have a small team. We don't know how to do everything perfectly by ourselves. And so, like, if we're going to try to do an investigation that's like actually like not in Chicago, like we found we really want a partner who's outside of the city who really knows, right? We did a big investigation of police dog bites, and it started because we found some stuff in data in Indianapolis that looked really troubling. And our next step was, well, we're never going to effectively do this by ourselves. We need to go find someone. So we found local reporters who were really well resourced, really well sourced within the local police department. And that's sort of like the ideal, right? Like we were able to bring in, like, oh, we know how to use this data. We know what police departments tend to do. You have sources on the inside, and together we're both hearing the same thing. So we should really investigate this together. It's not always so perfect, but I think like that's really always been an important part of our reporting. And I think part of it is also like knowing that we're gonna have to, like, as much as we have our own style and way of working, I think we also know that we're going to be shifted somewhat by who we're working with. And I think it's always, again, like there's a real balance. You can find yourself working with a giant national newspaper and sort of maybe drawn outside of what you would actually be comfortable doing. You have to be careful about that. But I think also, like, when you're working with local reporters who have their own understanding of community, you also have to be willing to be shifted by that in the reporting and understand, like, the way that we might be coming in thinking about how to frame an investigative story isn't exactly like the way that it's going to land or the way that's going to be most effective or the way that's necessarily right. And so we really try to welcome that back and forth when we take on a partnership, because it's always like there's not never a partnership where like you see eye to eye the entire time and it's just incredible. Like there's always back and forth and tension, and I don't think we're afraid of that. We're just like, this part of the process, and we kind of welcome hearing what someone else thinks on this, because that's how it actually works.
Can you give an example of when that happened, and maybe it was rough, but both newsrooms came out at the end satisfied?
Yeah, I think I think actually, so when we reported on the dog bites and on the dogs, we kind of initially came up with some data findings. We went to the local editor at the ND Star, and they were sort of like, "Oh, great! Like we could just like throw this out, like we could publish this tomorrow. This is a good little, you know." And we had to go back and forth, be like, "Wait! You think there's actually something like we think it'll be more effective? We think we need a little bit more time." But I also got why they wanted to do that, right? Like that makes sense. Like if I were in their shoes, I think I might be like, oh yeah, like absolutely, like that can be a good story on the, you know, in the local section, like immediately. But we really we spent a lot of time like talking about like why there was resonance beyond, like why we think it could go deeper. And I think that meant like being willing to like almost like present the case and like put the case together and spend the time talking through like very realistically what their expectations were. And so that was like actually like the rate of dog bites we're seeing in your city is higher than these other cities that have had massive dog bite scandals. Like it's actually much higher. And we suspect that if we go and get data from across the country, you might be at the very top of the list, which is actually what actually was the case. And I think when they saw that, I think they were able to say, like, no, I think I can see the contours of an investigation that will like land differently with the city officials, you know, if we give it a little bit of space. And they were willing to buy into that when we kind of spent the time, took the conversations, tried to meet them with where they were kind of balancing with their different questions here too. And I think, and this is like I don't think this always happens with reporting, but in this case, like it worked, right? Like I think dog bites are down 90% since we published. I've written investigations where I've never seen that direct impact. You know, you can't bet on that. You can't assume that's gonna happen. But I think in this case, like the thing that we were hoping to do together, we were able to do together.
I worked for newspapers owned by Knight Ridder, which doesn't exist anymore, and Gannett. And when I came to WBZ, I thought this is the way to be, a nonprofit newsroom, working in a place where I was not told you're doing too many stories about Black people, too many stories about poor people. I felt this freedom that had not been there with commercial media. Oh, I think other newsrooms have gotten hip to that. And there's so much more, like these new news organizations that are starting up in the city are nonprofit. So if you all could talk about those challenges with competing, and I mean, really the question is, will philanthropy save local journalism?
Well, it will certainly help. We are in the process of becoming a nonprofit. We started out as an LLC, and we've never been very profitable, so it seemed to make sense to become an official nonprofit. And I think that will be a big help to us. We are supported by our community. We have 250 or 300 people who give monthly to support the Lansing Journal. We are supported by local advertisers, often because there really is no other option for them, no other reasonably priced option. We're on the border of Indiana, so the next closest newspaper is an Indiana newspaper. And if you want to be in print, that's kind of where you have to be, and it costs hundreds of dollars for these tiny little mom and pop restaurants. So we offer an alternative, and they are responsive to that. The press forward.
Can you talk more about what that alternative, because you're talking about advertising, right?
Right.
So what is that alternative?
Just an alternative in pricing and in local reach. We're hitting their customers. We're hitting the town. We're the local newspaper. So we're mostly online right now. We're not in print very often. So learning digital advertising was another challenge, not just for me, but for the businesses I am trying to reach with advertising. But yeah, so advertising is one part of the mix. Local reader support is another part of the mix. The Press Forward grant we received was the first major grant we've received, and that has been a big help. That has given us some breathing room that we appreciate. And it's going to take a mix. There are limited resources in the world. We know even among funders, there are limited resources, and you have to make choices about the kinds of projects you're going to fund. So at the Lansing Journal, we are committed to making the most out of those gifts. We want to see a return on that investment just like you do.
Yeah, I think it's not going to save journalism, but I could tell you, philanthropy certainly has saved the Chicago Sun-Times. I want to congratulate all the people in this room and any of the other folks out there who made that merger between WBEZ and the Sun-Times happen. Because the Sun-Times would have probably, it might still be limping along, but it wouldn't be what it is and remains today. But, you know, you can't, there was a whole bunch of money, what was it, 60 million or something like that went into that effort. You can't do that every day, and I know philanthropy has many priorities, and journalism is just one of them. So I think we need to be realistic, but I think we need to work together with philanthropy, the news organizations that are being supported by philanthropy, to figure out what the future looks like, what those future funding streams are going to look like. Maybe it's moving into an area of advertising that maybe you wouldn't have, as a nonprofit news organization, you wouldn't have done before. One of the things we're thinking about at the Investigative Project is how to market and how to sell our training program, which we think is very valuable to other news organizations that need they want to have their journalists learn how to do this kind of reporting, this kind of data-driven reporting, so that we can actually derive income from that. Right now, we're still babies, so we're still primarily relying on foundation funding, and thank God for it. But I think we all know we have to diversify, and we have to figure out what the future looks like. And I don't think anyone really knows, you know, what funding streams for journalism are going to look like 5 or 10 years from now. But we know they're going to look very different from what they look like now.
Yeah, I'll just briefly. I think both of those points make a ton of sense, and I think the only thing I would add on top is I think that. I think Natalie, you asked kind of how this has affected collaboration in the city, and I think there are ways where you can feel that, you know, newsrooms know that we're applying for the same grants, right? And there's some knowledge of that. I think on the other hand, sometimes you're all funded by some of the same sources too, and that makes it a little easier to say, like, look, we can just work together. There isn't a need for us to treat each other like we're all the Tribune or the Sun-Times, you know, right? We're all like small newsrooms. We can actually really try to work together in meaningful ways and try to identify what that actually looks like in a way that's actually, everyone actually gets something useful out of. I think sometimes it's a lot more low key. I know a bunch of newsrooms kind of talked together a little bit ahead of the DNC, a bunch of the nonprofits. And it was not that we had to do something huge or extreme, but it was like, we should know who we are, who's gonna be there. We should know, you know, if you need to lean on someone in your one reporter from your newsroom, who else is around, right? It doesn't have to be really complicated, but it can also be really regular. I also I think that I think there's a real strength in Chicago having this many outlets. Like, I think we still don't have anywhere near the level of journalists to what we heard at the start that we used to have. And there's also like a real value in having different approaches to how to tell stories and news. And so I hope that, I agree that philanthropy's been done a lot to help kind of support this ecosystem. And I hope that people who are giving and supporting, I think, both feel appreciation, but also appreciation for the like diversity of newsrooms here. I think it produces like together a very powerful set of journalism that wouldn't exist even if you had the same number of journalists and just a much smaller number of newsrooms. So I think that's valuable and sometimes like hard to place a value on because it's hard to see.
One other thing I would want to just point out is I think that we often overlook, you're doing a great job with YouTube, but we often overlook broadcast outlets and broadcast news as a source and an opportunity. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there for us to all work closely with news organizations that are on the broadcast side, whether it be radio or radio TV. I'm proud to also serve on the board of Block Club Chicago along with Charles. And one of the things they've been very good at is developing partnerships with TV outlets. WCIU TV, they have a regular television show with them. They work with WGN Radio. They have a regular radio show. Again, it's a way of amplifying all the great stories that they're already doing, the great stories you're doing, and getting them not only to wider audiences, but maybe to different audiences that they wouldn't be able to get to on their own. And so I think that there's some opportunity to expand there as well.
Before I take audience questions, I want to talk about another positive shift. I would say that's grown in the past decade, in addition to collaboration, what audience and community engagement looks like. And these are jobs in newsrooms now. And these folks are at the beginning of stories, particularly long-form journalism, and not coming in at the end about, okay, how do you promote this? So if any of you can talk about some of the engagement aspects of your work.
I can start out briefly and just really briefly and say that I think that's something that we've been experimenting with for a long time, and I think that with our recent reporting about missing in Chicago, I think we tried to build in a bunch of different points of contact, to your point, like not so it's just at the end, but when we were actually doing the data science that like started the story, that was actually where we probably worked with more volunteers than any other point, where I think we had ultimately like 200 different people help tag Chicago police data to understand patterns in the complaint, train a model. And I think those people stayed pretty engaged with the reporting in the years afterwards, where it took, I started to publish, as we started to like hold events and meetings, and I think that really helped the story like have some like long-term staying power and traction, to have like a lot of people being kind of interested, thinking about it from the start. And then those same people came to, when we held a bunch of reading groups about this story later on, when we had a bunch of events, like those people were interested in part of that process as well. So I think we've been thinking about that a lot, and I will just especially shout out, that's something that I think Press Forward has helped support in particular, in terms of the engagement work, in terms of us like being able to invest the time after we publish an investigation to do stuff like that. I think it's been really important for us.
This may be the difference between suburban journalism and Chicago journalism, but a lot of our community engagement consists of things like people can submit a weather photo, and we'll publish that with the weather every day. So all of our weather photos are little pictures of Lansing. People can submit letters to the editor. We call them local voices. And if you have something on your mind that I can't say, or I can't investigate, or make a story out of, you are free to submit that, write it up, and as long as it's respectful and of interest to the community, we will publish it, and you can have your name published. We invite people to comment on our stories. We invite people to engage with us on Facebook. Our YouTube audience now that I'm getting to know, I go onto YouTube and answer those comments and, you know, put the little smiley faces and the thumbs up, and that does mean something. It sounds sort of superficial, but they like knowing that I'm a real person and I care about what they say, and I think that is attractive in a small community like ours for sure, but maybe in other ways too.
I think it picks up on what you said earlier about trust. The more you can engage with your readers, with the community that you're serving, the closer you are to them, the more credibility that gives you. And we're in a world now where we all know about how distrustful readers and viewers are of the news and all the misinformation that's out there. So the closer you can be to the ground, the more trust you can build. One of the things I'm worried about, especially, again, with the legacy, bigger news organizations, is because of the work from home trend and because of all the changes that have been wrought by the pandemic. I think that we're further and further, in general, further and further away from the folks that we're covering. We're not in our offices in the Tribune Tower anymore, but we're probably at home, and maybe home is not necessarily where the story is or where the people that you want to serve is. And so I think we had to be much more sensitive and conscious of that, because again, if you're not in those communities, if you don't know those folks, if they don't see your face and hear your voice, you're not going to be able to build the kind of trust you need to do a great job.
Well, we have about 15 minutes for questions before we close this evening. Do we have anyone who's going to, oh yes, we have mics right here, okay.
Hi.
We'll bring the mic down to you.
In a second, Bruce.
Oh, I can shout. My question is, when does the Lansing Journal print, and what makes that decision?
I want to repeat that for folks who may not have been able to hear. When does the Lansing Journal print, and who makes the decision? But no, what makes the decision?
That's a great question, thank you. We used to be in print monthly before the pandemic, and that was a regular thing that people came to expect, and it was a way for us to get in every house in Lansing, so that was a good way for us to get started. Our printer went out of business during the pandemic. Everything changed during the pandemic. A lot of our advertisers suffered. So we published our last regular print issue in April of 2020. Then we managed to put one together in December of 2020, and people were so excited to receive this on their porches, and it was like Christmas in December. And that was very encouraging to see, but that got harder and harder to do. The longer you're out of print, the harder it is to put together a print product, because there's such a time lag between when the news happens and when you can get on the press and when you can get it delivered to people's homes. And people got used to getting our daily email, so they were on a different time schedule now too. And so when you're planning a print issue, you have to choose topics that are gonna be news 2 weeks after they happen, and that is harder and harder to find. So we have found that the most reliable reason for us to be in print now is an election year. So our election year happens in 2025. April is when the supervisor will be reelected, the Thornton Township Board will be reelected, village board, school board, park board. So we use that print issue as a voter guide. We gather all of the candidate information and publish it. And it makes sense to be in print because people can spread it out, they can look at the photos, they can read the bios, they can make notes in the margin. People take that to the polls with them and use it as a voter guide. So that's really the only specific time that we're in print anymore.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you. This has been fascinating. This is great. And Natalie, you asked actually two of the burning questions that I had in my mind. So this is a little, kind of moving a little bit away, but I'm just curious. The report that you did on the dog bites that had such an impact, how do you understand how that impact happened? I don't know, the avenue or the direction that might have taken to have made the impact that it did?
That's a great question. I think actually, it's one I've been thinking about, because I think actually the way that story had impact is a way that it's harder and harder for stories to have impact, and I think is not always how other reporting we've had has changed policy. I think that in some ways it was sort of I think part of it was we spent the time we reported, we had like really thought out all the ways that the city or the department might respond and had like really worked that into the reporting, right? And we're kind of, they announced some like really surface level reforms the day that we published, and we were kind of ready, and we had that baked into the story pretty much. Like, yeah, they've said that they're gonna do this and this, but it would actually only affect like 5 to 10% of all the cases we surveyed and wouldn't really fundamentally change the things that we had found. But I think it also spoke to like the Indy Star is a relatively, like, especially 5 years ago, a relatively strong local paper, had like a lot of, I think like politicians still pay attention to it and still feel accountable to it. Community leaders still responded to it too. And I think that a lot of them were like interviewed as part of the story. So I think it had kind of that traditional the big paper in town publishes a big story, and it really like people feel like they need to like shift in response to it. I think most of our reporting has actually used kind of a different model, because I think we know that it's harder and harder to do that. I think we've been talking about how all those big institutions have lost some of the sway that they used to have. So I think more and more, like I think part of why we did so much engagement work around missing in Chicago is that we know, there's probably nowhere in the city you can publish somewhere something where it's just gonna like sweep a bunch of policies aside in one day and like change everything. And so we know there has to be a sustained conversation. There has to be genuine community conversations that people who are not us are having and sustaining over time. Or like people in power are not gonna feel a lot of pressure to change. They're gonna feel like they can wait you out. They can say something nice when the story comes out about how they care, and then wait 3 months, 6 months. And so I think we're hoping this is what's happening here. We're still, again, like we're working on it. We're trying things the way a lot of our peers are trying things too. But I know Trina's gonna testify, I think if the schedule holds in front of City Council at a City Council hearing with Sarah Conway from City Bureau. I think Dorothy Tucker is also, like the other journalists are gonna be speaking as well. But I think talking in part about some of the reporting, and I think there's a push to create a task force still, even a year after publication, So I think we know like it can take a long time, and that's why but there's a reason we're putting that energy into that long-term engagement, is because actually more and more that feels like how you sustain impact, especially as a smaller newsroom like ours, where we can't, you know, we're not necessarily going to be in front of every politician in the city when we publish.
I was curious if the panelists could talk about growth and how important growing the organizations they're involved with is to increasing the impact you're having, and whether or not growth even plays a part in the way you think about opportunities in the future.
Well, it absolutely does, especially when you're a small nonprofit, as all of us are. The more you grow, the more impact you can have, the bigger staff you can have. Our challenge at the Investigative Project on Race and Equity is that we are a startup and we have a limited budget. We're very grateful for the support we've gotten across the community, but it's not enough to even hire full-time staff. So all of our staff is currently just part-time, including our executive director, our training director, our apprentices. We're very diligent about making sure we pay a living wage to all of our journalists. That's very important, but we can't pay them a full-time wage. We can't pay them full benefits right now. So that kind of growth is very important, and that kind of growth is sometimes the hardest to get funding for, because some funders want to fund a specific project or a specific beat. Personnel is harder to get support for, but you got to, the personnel and the people that do the work are at the heart of it. And then the other challenge we have is time, and Andrew's spoken about that very eloquently. We need enough time to be able to, especially if you're doing investigative reporting, enough time to produce a major project, and those don't happen overnight. They don't even happen often in 2 or 3 months. Sometimes it could take up to a year to do a really important investigation, especially if you're dealing with government agencies, and you know about that. Freedom of information requests and negotiating with agencies to get the information that you want to do the story. That takes a lot of time too. So we need the time and support. That's got to be part of our growth.
After that we have a young person down here who I would love to hear from. But no, you can, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful insights and questions. I'm really curious about the different leverage points that you're finding in journalism, where I know you mentioned YouTube and also convenings around the DNC, but places where maybe a smaller lift has gone in, but the impact has been more prolific.
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, one opportunity I think we all took advantage of is social media, and I know that can be a dirty word, especially given this really volatile political period we're in. But we find it's really important to promote and market our stories, our data, our people constantly on social media, and to always looking for new ways to tell that story in a different way, or tell the same story over and over again in different ways. So social media is a really important leverage point for us.
Yeah, and YouTube has been interesting. You know, YouTube has a reputation of sort of feeding the outrageousness, and a lot of, there's a range of people on YouTube. A lot of them are not journalists. They are influencers or opinion people or entertainers who can say things that I can't say in very colorful ways. And in some cases that helps, because they are bringing attention to the problem. And I think people recognize the difference between what they're doing and what I'm doing, and they want both. They enjoy the entertainment, but they want to know the real story too. And so to have that contrast has been interesting. And this is all new to me too. I'm learning this. It's a new culture, it's a new community, and it's been fun to learn.
My question was also about the dirty word, social media, and we mentioned YouTube a little bit, and now you say you're also doing things through social media, but I read something the other day where some crazy number of percentage of people got their main news source was Twitter. And on the one hand, that depresses me that your main news source is something that you can read in 140 characters or whatever. But on the other hand, to this topic, it's the most hyper-local source of news there is, where you really get to the minute, at the source news for things that are going around your community and down your block and everything else. And I'm just wondering what you think about the effect of that, whether that's the sign of the downfall of media, or on the other hand, a potentially really interesting source of hyper-localized news.
We are not really using Twitter at all. I think we do have a Twitter account, and I think some things are automatically feeding to it, but I don't pay attention to it at all. Mainly because I think Lansing is really not there. But what you say about the 140 characters is interesting, because and not to always go back to YouTube, but what I'm finding on YouTube is that people will sit for 2 hours and watch something. And when we were starting to do videos, I was so concerned about, we got to get this down to at least 10 minutes. If, 8 would be better, 4 would be better. And so we were trimming and clipping and editing and trying to make a short video. But the YouTube audience wants to go deep. They can get short clips on WGN. They'll get 3 minutes on WGN about Tiffany Henyard. They want to know more. They want to see the meeting. They want to learn all they can. And that was a little bit surprising to me. They will sit for 2 hours and watch this meeting. And there's hope there, I think, because they are engaged the whole time. Now, they won't probably sit at a boring school board meeting, but they are paying attention. They are going deep. They want to know more. So I don't know exactly what the message is in there, but I find it hopeful.
Well, one thing that had stayed with me tonight is how people have said it has inspired them to go to meetings in their own communities.
Yeah.
Like, you can't beat that kind of advertisement for civic engagement. Okay, we have time this is our last question.
Okay, so as nonprofit newsrooms with limited resources, as you're discussing, how do you determine what kinds of stories to focus on, especially with those longer investigative projects? And as an add-on, how do you know when it's time to collaborate with other newsrooms?
I'm actually collaborating right now because there is a Thornton Township meeting happening tonight, and I can't be there. But the newspaper in the town, a couple towns away from me, is going to be there. I reached out to him. He's been very helpful to us in the past. He's a little further down the development path than we are, so I've learned a lot from him. He's always been very generous with his advice, with his experience. So he's gonna cover the meeting tonight, and I wish I could be there, but I'm happy to be here too.
Well, I could answer that just in terms of the police traffic stop story that we did, where we looked at 20 years of police traffic stops throughout Illinois. And I guess, Matt, you said it's up to, is Matt Kiefer still here? Matt, it's up to, we looked at like 45 million records of police, 45 million records of police traffic stops over time. And that was a story that came to us from Matt, who had spent a lot of time acquiring that database. And we decided, Matt was at WBEZ at the time, but he's a reporter, Chicago Reporter alum, so we decided we would work together, lucky for us. And so that was sort of a circumstantial thing, but it was a very compelling story at the time, a year or so ago when we did it, because and it remains so because there have been so many, especially recently, egregious, examples of traffic stops in Chicago where cops have stopped people under such, questionable circumstances, and folks have been shot or killed. So it certainly was a compelling time and a compelling topic to cover. And so we try to look at our stories that way. What's going on in the world that we're looking at, what's going on in the city that's most important, and what can we do to add to the conversation?
I'll just really quickly add, in terms of how to pick stories, like I think it's a conversation our newsroom has a lot, and I think as a nonprofit, And as a nonprofit, that's like relatively, I know we try to share decision-making as much as possible, and that's always a work in progress. But I think it means we try to talk together as a whole team about like, what are we actually gonna spend time on? Like, it matters, like if we are picking these big projects that take a long time, that could take a year, like we need to understand the choice we're making together, because it's a choice with our organization, it's a choice with our time, it's a bet on like, this is the story that we think is gonna be the one that is actually the one that matters the most. So more and more, we're trying to find a way to talk together and make that decision as jointly as we can, because we recognize, I think to the point, if you're behind your question, like how important that choice is.
I'm gonna, oh, yeah, here you are.
First, just Melanie, Laura, Andrew, and Natalie, I want to thank you for giving us all, thank you for your time, giving us the gift, through the gift, this podium is bigger than me, so I'm just gonna stand up here and look at you and say thank you for giving us your time tonight, to give us a glimpse into what I think is truly the future of news and journalism for us in Chicago. And even though you didn't sugarcoat any of the real challenges, real practical challenges that you are facing every day, it is a story and it is a future that is about collaboration, about innovation, about true civic engagement. And I could not be more proud to be a Chicagoan and part of this community of innovators that are pushing through the real challenges that the news business is facing today, and leading the way to a brighter future. I want to thank all of you for spending your afternoon with us today. If what you heard today moved you to want to support with your philanthropy news and news ecosystem in Chicago, please talk to any of our panelists about giving directly to their organizations. They definitely deserve our support. Or talk to any of my colleagues who are wearing the Chicago Community Trust name badge about being part of Press Forward Chicago. We believe there's room for all of that philanthropy. There's real benefit to being part of this pooled fund of philanthropy, because we are all putting our resources to work together and learning together how to move forward. So again, thank you so much for being here. Please join us for refreshments right out front, and hope you'll get some time to mingle with one another and with our guests. Thank you all.